Okie doke. So can everyone hear? Yes? Yes? Good. Okay, we'll strive to maintain a certain level of formality, although this is definitely an in-house family get-together. I always say every time I'm at Will's that this feels like the home congregation. This is where we can let our hair down even when we speak from the pulpit. And I encountered Will a few weeks ago at a buffet, and he said, "I'm glad to see you." And I said, "I'm glad to see you." And he said, "This must mean we both need money." So why don't we plan an event? But we needed a draw, so we thought probably we could lend some respectability to the enterprise by getting a British theoretical biologist to throw in with the plan. So every year now for several years, the annual return of the sheldrakes to Turtle Island has been a high point in the social calendar. And sometimes it happens in the spring and sometimes in the late summer, but it always is an excuse to suspend the ordinary rules of engagement and party down as much as we can with these wonderful people. And Rupert and I have not seen each other for 10 months or so. Flew in from Vancouver this afternoon. I saw he and Jill for the first time this evening. I have yet to see Merlin, who is the latest adumbration of the Sheldrakean morphogenetic concrescence. And I'm sure he lives up to the name. So the way we conceived of this is I just think that what goes on in our living rooms is much more exciting even without the dope smoking than what goes on in the public lecture situation. So the idea was for Rupert and I to get together again, get to catch up again, and have you as part of the extended family participate in this. So on very short notice I conceived this and called it Forms and Mysteries, Morphogenetic Fields and Psychedelic Experiences, as a kind of effort to split the deck two ways equally, you know. Although in the past, Rupert and I have participated at Esalen. We spent a very interesting afternoon talking about the theory of formative causation and what it might say about the psychedelic experience pharmacologically, psychologically, historically, and so forth. Forms and Mysteries seem to me a fitting title because, of course, form is a mystery that even science is willing to acknowledge. This is the great terra incognito of modern science, is the persistence and genesis of form. What is it? Where does it come from? And what sustains it? And typical of the history of science, the more complex problems have been postponed historically until epistemological and analytical capabilities were sufficient to deal with the problem. This is why, for instance, linguistics was no more than a metaphor until the 20th century. And in a sense, I think probably morphogenesis was in the same situation, because powerful mathematical tools have had to be invented to carry it out of the realm of mere theoretical discussion. Rupert has been, I think, the most radical of all the people who have proposed a revisioning of causality, and by extension the domain of science, what it is able to claim as its purvey. And I think that his position has been at first ignored, and more recently with the publication of his second book excoriated, because this is no small matter. This is actually a question of fundamental epistemic importance to the entire scientific enterprise, because what is being proposed in the theory of the morphogenetic field is a revisioning of causality. The second book, which if you haven't read it, you're certainly missing an intellectual adventure. It's like a chance to read the Principia when the person who wrote it is striding around town giving lectures. It's really a rare intellectual adventure. I haven't known that kind of excitement reading theoretical biology since discovering L.L. White when I was a kid. But what is being proposed is a fundamental revisioning of how events happen in the world. And very fundamental to the performance of science is the notion of experiment. And experiment rests on the relatively unexamined concept of the restoration of initial conditions. Well, the Sheldrakean cosmos would play havoc with the notion of the restoration of initial conditions, because what it is saying is that the universe is a steadily accreting and self-defining set of interlocking habits, and that that slices into this waveform interference pattern of habit are therefore necessarily going to be time dependent. In other words, it looks different at each point in its history. It makes it very hard, therefore, to see how in an atmosphere like that, ordinary science can be prosecuted at all. So the interest that it holds for me then is that it seems to be a very calm, rational, attentive program of intellectual understanding which leads to the same radical conclusions that an emergence in the core experience of archaism, the psychedelic experience, argues for. In other words, that all our intellectual constructs are in fact built on shifting sands, and all knowledge is provisional at this stage in the epistemic enterprise. It doesn't mean that a more epistemically grounded knowing is not possible. It merely means that up to this point, it has not occurred. Science's claim to fulfill this function is now in serious trouble. It actually has been in some areas since the elaboration of quantum physics in the 20s, but Sheldrake is coming at it not from a realm of extremely arcane mathematical modeling, but in the biological realm, with a model which is both simultaneously true to felt experience and confounding to the scientific paradigm as it has been waged since Bacon, essentially. So Rupert is with us tonight. He will tell you, I hope, the state of the art in terms of experiments and the public dialogue that attends these things, because make no mistake about it, the overturning of a scientific paradigm is a political act, and it has to do with reputations and tenure and publication and people who have built their lives defending something that they now see under severe attack. what I believe is happening, and that Rupert and my own fascination with the psychedelic experience and other phenomena in society all can be brought under the single umbrella of a resurgent vitalism, an awareness of the living vitality of form and organism and experience. And this is something that, in order to do its work, the Newtonian model had to expunge all that, had to call these things secondary qualities, epiphenomenal, derivative, this, that, and the other. And yet, these are the existential stuff of the felt world of being. So Rupert brings to biology a theory which links it back into physics and forward to psychology in a way that restores meaning, however much it may do damage to the somewhat infantile wish of the Cartesians to construct a closed tautology, which is really what they want to do, you know, and that's why they want to get rid of all these troubling phenomena that are of such a complexity that it exceeds their model. Well, I'm a great fan of this theory. I could run on at length about it, but the man who invented it is here with us. He can lead us to a deeper understanding of it. Please welcome Rupert Sheldrake, the greatest biologist of the age.
Well, you see, it's a paradoxical situation. It's a difficult act to follow, and yet I've somehow got to try after that build-up. I mean, it's. I think what Terence his explanation of how morphic resonance works is obviously eloquent and bardic, and I agree with it. And the point that he's put to us now is the thing about the experimental tests. This coming down very much to earth after this wonderful flight of Terence's imagination into those realms of the imagination that he leads us so easily. The tests so far have mostly been on human subjects. And those of you who've seen the new edition of A New Science of Life, which just came out 2 or 3 months ago in the United States, which was published about 3 years ago in Britain, that edition contains an appendix which brings you up to date on what had happened up until 1985. It contains a summary of the controversies and the discussions, including a reprint of the full Nature editorial attack, the book for burning article. And it also summarizes the experiments which were done in the realm of hidden images, puzzle pictures. I've talked about those before several times here and in San Francisco, so I'm not going to go into those, but those were, roughly speaking, experiments that involved showing hidden pictures containing a hidden image, a puzzle picture, on television to millions of people. And the test was to find out whether more people in other countries could recognize it, could spot the hidden image in these puzzle pictures before, if more could do it after it had been shown on TV in one country than before. So groups of subjects were tested in a variety of countries. The transmissions took place on British television, first on Thames Television, and then another experiment on the BBC involving about 8 million people in the audience. And the tests in other countries were done by volunteer experimenters. The tests involved 2 puzzle pictures. People in other countries were shown both of these for 30 seconds each. They had to guess or say what they saw in it. They were either right or wrong, easy to mark, and whether they got the hidden image or not. And the same two pictures were tested on different subjects after the TV transmission. One of them was a control, the other one that was shown on TV. Anyway, these experiments, which were then repeated in Germany, gave interesting but variable results. The first one showed a large increase, a significant increase at the 1% level of probability in the recognition of the transmitted picture compared with the control picture, which remained constant. Very gratifying result. And so the experiment was done again on BBC with its larger audience. The second experiment showed a strong positive effect in Western Europe. More people in Germany and the countries recognized the picture shown on TV in Britain and the control picture didn't change. But it showed no effect in North America. Now, these results were very puzzling, and it's the kind of thing that, what do you make of that? I don't expect morphic resonance to work by a distance effect, which is the most obvious explanation. Could it be that somehow people in Europe, being in the same time zone, are more in phase with each other than those in the US at 6 to 9 hours shifted? If morphic resonance works as a resonance, then what phase people are in should be an important variable. So that's one possibility. And that's suggested by the results from South Africa, which is only 1 hour different from Britain, and at least as far away as New York and other places it was tested, which showed similar results to the European ones. It wasn't distance, it was time zone that seemed to be the variable. Anyway, this experiment was then done again in Germany. The pictures were new pictures, of course, in each experiment. And the pictures there were transmitted on a Sunday afternoon on a program there, and tests were done all around the world. No effect in North America. A highly significant effect in Britain. But in Britain, although it was highly significant and the control was no different, and the sample tested was something like 20,000 people. This was a huge sample. It was probably the biggest experiment ever done in terms of the number of participants. The effect showed that the picture had become significantly harder to recognize in Britain after it had been seen by a lot of Germans on a Sunday afternoon. Well, at this stage, I thought, well, this is too close to a kind of standard parapsychological experiment, a one-shot thing. I discussed it with Russell Targ, who I met at a conference, and he said, I bet if you do this experiment, you'll get all sorts of weird precognitive effects and so on. It's so like a parapsychology experiment. You'll get the same kind of anomalies and bizarre things that we get in ours. And I thought, well, maybe that was one way of looking at it. And thought that probably I should do what is more in the spirit of the hypothesis, namely try and test for the effect of repeated exposures, because it's a hypothesis of repetition leading to habit, not a kind of one-shot event. I wanted to look for where puzzle pictures, for example, could be seen many times. Well, at this stage, it turned out that the only way to do this feasibly, since I couldn't persuade a TV company to show the same puzzle picture in the same test hundreds of times on their program, the obvious way to do that would be to have it in a TV commercial, or to have it in advertising in hoardings. And at this stage, I entered into discussions with various leading members of the advertising industry, including some at the think tank here in San Francisco. And it seemed that they were indeed quite interested in this approach. And at that stage, they sent to me from their offices in Madison Avenue for some puzzle pictures and started doing some trial ones for a campaign. But at this stage, I began to get cold feet. I began to think, do I really want the first tests of morphic resonance to be done directly and completely as part of a kind of advertising stunt and as part of an advertising research project? And it's not, things should continue as they begin to some extent, and I thought it just wasn't a very auspicious beginning. And I didn't get too involved with that. I've sort of backed down on that one. They also had fears from their clients because anything to do with hidden images, advertisers are terrified of being accused of subliminal advertising. And so there's a kind of paranoia the minute hidden images come up. Anyway, so that experiment's on the back burner. Several other projects are in the pipeline. A friend of mine has invented a puzzle in England, a 9-piece geometrical puzzle, which is exceedingly hard to do. It took me hours and hours to solve it. It's got tens of thousands, millions of combinations, and there's 148 possible answers, but they're very hard to find. He's planning to market this in the near future, or in the more or less near future, and so we're setting up an experiment that would go with that if it is marketed. We'd monitor in other countries where it's marketed the rate at which people can solve it under standard conditions, and then measure at regular intervals in other countries before it's released there, to see whether millions of people or thousands or tens of thousands learning it in Britain affect these successes. It's like monitoring the ability of people to solve the Rubik cube if you'd got in right at the beginning. It's that kind of thing, only on a smaller scale. Anyway, that's one thing in the pipeline. The other thing is the 3 experiments which won the Terence Prize, which was awarded in June 1986 for tests of morphic resonance. All involved experiments on the ability of human beings to learn things that millions of people had learned before. Again, I won't go into these in detail because they're all written up in my new book, The Presence of the Past. Briefly, they involved the ability to learn or recognize words in languages unknown to the person in the written form. One involved Hebrew words written in Hebrew. The other involved Persian words written in Persian. These 2 experiments were very similar. They were done independently, one in the United States at Yale by Gary Schwartz, the other in Britain, by 2 people who both independently devised a very similar test to test for morphic resonance. Itself an interesting fact. And these tests showed the ability of people to learn things more readily if they were things that other people had learned before. The 3rd test was on Morse code. The main experiments that have been going on, apart from other ones planned in the human psychology realm, the ones that are actually going on right now are in the realms of chemistry and in fruit fly development. The experiment that's going on in Warwick University at this moment concerns protein folding. In my new book I discuss this. If proteins are unfolded, then it may be that they fold up again, which involves a complex morphogenetic process at the molecular level, which can be monitored using quite simple techniques. When they fold up again, they may be refolding in a way that they've not done in nature before. Especially, there are reasons why this would be so for certain particular enzymes. And so the more often they're refolded, they should learn how to do it, as it were, and the refolding process should take place measurably quicker. Well, we have an experiment going on to test for this, the refolding of enzymes, and then repeated refolding to see if it happens quicker. I don't know the results yet. It's still going on, and I'm not sure whether it will give conclusive results or not within the summer, which is when the project ends. The other one's on fruit flies and the development of fruit flies, following up results that already suggest that when fruit flies are developed in response to an abnormal stimulus, like ether or higher temperatures during pupation, that the abnormal flies, for example flies with extra veins in their wings, a certain proportion are produced by this stress from the environment. But the more flies that have been exposed to the stress, the more that have become abnormal, the greater the abnormal response is when fresh ones are put into this stress. This has already been found, and it looks very much like a morphogenetic morphic resonance effect. And some more experiments are going on to test the earlier results that showed this result to be the case. Again, those experiments are about halfway through at the moment. So these are some of the things that are going on to test the theory. I should perhaps mention one attempt to refute the theory that's been made and recently published in the Skeptical Inquirer. I don't know how many people here are readers of the Sceptical Inquirer, perhaps rather few. But the Sceptical Inquirer, as you may know, is the house journal of PsyCop, the debunking organisation, and the one that's most famous for James Randi being among its activists. And this was published, it was a paper by Francisco Varela, who claimed to have refuted the hypothesis of formative causation. And the experiment that he'd done involved programming a desktop computer to carry out a particular operation, measure the time it took to do it, and then repeat this operation millions of times, and then measuring the rate of it. And he found that the computer didn't do it any quicker. So he concluded that this refuted the hypothesis of formative causation, and he first wrote this paper in 1983 and sent it to me, and suggested we had a public discussion on this, which I agreed to. So we had 2 or 3 exchanges, and the idea was to publish the papers together. I argued in my first exchange that it didn't test the theory because the theory only applies to indeterminate quantum systems which contain enough indeterminacy for these probabilistic fields to get a grip on it, whereas computers are completely determinate in their functioning. There's nothing that the fields could do. Secondly, that computers are not self-organizing systems in the same sense that morphogenetic systems in cells, crystals, molecules, and atoms are. Rather, the program that's going on is not something that's created itself, but rather something which Varela had thought up and put inside the machine. There was nothing self-organizing about that. And therefore, this wasn't a test of the theory. Anyway, Varela didn't agree, and said that I couldn't maintain that living organisms were not machines like computers, because both organisms and machines were machines, and that there was no difference between computers and living organisms because they were all machines. So we got into this kind of argument, and I said I thought that was rubbish and that it wasn't like that at all, and so on. Anyway, what happened then was that a physicist, the late Professor Michael Ovenden of the University of British Columbia, who was one of the judges of the Tarrytown competition, read Varela's paper, which was entered for the competition, and all 4 judges rejected as being a valid test of the theory. He pointed out to me that it didn't test the theory because the way computers work is that every microsecond or so there's a pulse, and the instructions are carried out pulse-wise. So a program with 30 steps in would take 30 microseconds because each step is pulsed by this internal clock. Well, roughly speaking, that seems to be what's going on in the computer. Varela's program of 30 steps took 30 microseconds for his computer to do. It's a computer that has a microsecond clock. And after millions of repetitions, it still took 30 microseconds. Well, all this shows is that the clock that pulses the things in the computer was pulsing the instructions at exactly the rate that the computer has to pulse them at, namely 1 microsecond. And so it took 30 microseconds to run through these instructions. Even if the silicon chips had responded quicker to the pulses, then it wouldn't have shown up in this experiment because they would still have had to happen every microsecond. Anyway, this error in the basis of the experiment was pointed out to him. Anyway, he published the original paper, and I've now written a reply in the Sceptical Inquirer pointing out these issues. But when I sent this into the editor of the Sceptical Inquirer, he wrote back to me saying that my reply probably wouldn't come out till the winter number, since the letters section of the fall number was already full of letters from other people pointing out the same error. So that's the status of the refutation debate at the moment, and you'll be able to see these various things in the forthcoming next 2 issues of the Sceptical Inquirer, should you ever see it around. There are quite a number of projects being planned in the realms of chemistry and developmental biology and experimental psychology. Some funding has become available for morphic resonance research, which is why these projects are going on right now, owing to the generosity of 3 or 4 individuals, and then smaller subscriptions through the Fund for Morphic Resonance Research from individuals who have been good enough to try and help this process along. And this money really has helped it along, because it has made it possible to hire people to do these experiments in labs, in universities, and there are quite a number of universities ready and willing to do them. And the only limiting factor at the moment is money to hire the people to do them. We're hiring students in the summer vacation to do these projects, because that way we can get a 3 to 4 month project done for $1,500. Yes?
I don't know if I'm the only one in the audience who really doesn't grasp what the theory of morphogenetic resonance is, but I'd appreciate a couple of sentence description.
Yes, quite right. Well, I should have said that at the beginning. All right.
Both those. Thanks.
The theory, sorry about that, I was assuming that most people did know, and I should have realized that not everybody would, and maybe most don't.
Something intrigues me about it, but I don't grasp it.
Well, it's hard to grasp in its detailed forms, but that's what our dialogue was going to be about, and some of these things. But in basically what it's saying is that the so-called laws of nature are like habits, that things happen the way they do because they've happened that way before. The way crystals crystallize depends on the way the same compound has crystallized in the past. The way rats learn a new trick depends on whether other rats have learned it before. If rats in another place have already learned it, then it'll be easier to learn somewhere else for subsequent rats by the process called morphic resonance. So there's a kind of collective memory in nature, in different species, in different kinds of things. And this collective memory is transferred from the past to the present by the process I call morphic resonance. And that means that in general, new things which happen repeatedly should happen more and more easily, or more and more quickly, or more and more probably as time goes on, because of the effect of the build-up of this morphic resonance. And this theory is controversial, as Terence pointed out, because it's not the way that scientists usually think about these things. And the issue that I've just been discussing is various experimental ways to test it, because this theory says when proteins fold up a new way and do it repeatedly, they should do it quicker. And when some people have learned something in one country, like on television in a hidden image, it should make it easier for others to spot it elsewhere. Or if fruit flies have developed in a new way, for example with extra veins in their wings, then the more that do it, the easier it should get for others to do it, other things being equal. And that's the point of all these experiments I've been describing. They're all designed to test this theory, to see whether there is in fact this kind of memory or habit in nature. There's one more aspect of the theory that I should mention, which is that it leads to a completely new interpretation of memory. And it says that our ordinary memories of what we've done depend not on traces or physical material changes stored in the brain, like traces on a tape recorder or recordings in a hologram. It doesn't depend on a material storage system in the brain. Rather, memory depends on tuning in to our own past directly by morphic resonance. And the brain's more like a tuning system than a storage system. Damage to the brain can interfere with the tuning or the reception, and so you can get loss of memory through brain damage, but the memory isn't in the brain. And just as we tune into our own memories from our own past, so we also tune into the memories of large numbers of other people, and this is similar as a notion to what Jung called the collective unconscious. So that's a summary of what it's all about. And the experiments I've just been talking about were in response to Terence asking for an update on the experimental test situation. So that's more or less what's been going on so far in the way of experimental tests. And more are in the pipeline, and the limiting factor at the moment is funds, and some funds are becoming available. So that's where we are from that point of view.
Yes, I might say about all this, to my mind, the criticism of the theory has to this point been fairly inane. and largely carried out by people who didn't really understand the theory. That doesn't mean that it is not open to criticism. The reason I have such an interest in it is because it solved a lot of what I felt were outstanding problems in my own model building efforts, but it certainly raises other questions. In the first paragraph of The Presence of the Past, Rupert condenses the theory into a slogan which could be shouted in a theater or a parade. It's that things are as they are because they were as they were. And that, in essence, is what this theory is saying. Well, now notice that this is as conservative a point of view as one could possibly imagine. The problem, if you believe things are as they are because they were as they were, then your problem is to account for anything new or novel ever happening. How, in a world where things are as they are because they were as they were, are you ever going to get creative advance? It seems to preclude it from the outset. Well, what drew me originally to Rupert, or what drew us together, was I had a theory that was entirely about accounting for novelty. And that was what it delivered on, was a model of how new things could come into being. Rupert's theory is a model of how structure is conserved and perpetuated through time. So my thought was you could bring these together, and if they were not mutually exclusive, then you would find out why there was persistence of form, why there was this overwhelming presence of the past, and yet why there could still be apparently free will and novel situations arise. And you really participate, when you participate in this idea, in an intellectual adventure upon which the curtain has only risen. No one can stride to a blackboard this afternoon, this evening, and write the equations of the morphogenetic field. We are a long, long way from that. This is basically at the level of parlor room discussion. But if the morphogenetic field is written, then if the equations are written, then it will flower into who knows what, in the same way that when the electromagnetic equations were finally written by Clerk Maxwell, suddenly radio, television, all of these things became a possibility. I think that accounting for form is the great unsolved problem that science has put off for about 500 years. Accounting for novelty is a somewhat newer problem that is not even addressed by science until you get to the theory of evolution in the 1850s, and then only addressed in the biological realm. The theory that I originally elaborated had novelty as the downsloping part of a fractal wave, and the upmoving part of that wave I called entropy or disconnectedness, or I can't even remember. And it was Rupert who said you should call it habit. And you should see then that the world is an ebb and flow of habit versus novelty, of temporal situations of varying durations in which the presence of the past is so overwhelming that that basically the past is replayed in that space-time domain. And yet There are other space-time domains where the way in which causality and formative causation come together creates novel connection. And these novel connections come into being with their own morphogenetic field, with their own ability to be a past present in a future yet to be realized. So, though I think that the attacks that have been mounted so far have been trivial, the real challenge for the morphogenetic field is to formalize itself, to aim toward mathematical expression, and to construct itself in such a way that the self-evidence of novelty is not sacrificed in the way that the Newtonian model had to sacrifice the self-evidence of primary experience, of felt experience. So you haven't, and I haven't talked about this much, but I would love to hear you talk about the conservation of novelty in a universe ruled by formative causation, and how you see that, and perhaps the way in which it plays into the psychedelic issue is that we can take the word habit very generally and realize that one of the curious things about ourselves as higher animals is our susceptibility to habituations. I define habituation as unexamined obsessive behavior. Seems reasonable. And we are, more than any other creature, we seem to fall into behavioral loops of television watching, snack consuming, fascist voting patterns, tasteless tonsorial tendencies, and so forth. What precisely, if you see, my notion, again to try and unite the psychedelic thing with what Rupert is doing, my notion of a new model of the psychedelic experience is to call these things morphogenetic field amplifiers. And to say, this is why in the presence of a psychedelic experience, one can hold an object in their hand and visualize its past states. This is how shamans determine who stole the hen, or where the sacred, or who's sleeping with who. Actually, the morphogenetic field, if sufficiently amplified to sufficient clarity, is nothing more or less than a record of the past history of whatever is being examined. So that suddenly, instead of being focused in a kind of atomized present with a receding past and an anticipated future, we lose our particulate nature as the individual, as meat object, and we enter into ourselves defined as a morphogenetic field, as a body of wave mechanically maintained information about past and future states of time. And you may be sure that these theories, like the theory of formative causation, like the theory of relativity, like the theory of Newtonian mechanics, eventually filter down into the realm of everyday experience and common models of ordinary consciousness. And if the morphogenetic field theory or idea was to become empowered as the model for millions and millions of people, then the past and the future would change in their connotation to our existential dilemma. It is, I think, probably the ultimate legacy of the transition from a particulate to a wave mechanical point of view. It binds us to the past at the same time that it exorcises the terror of the future, And it really empowers the notion of Tao. So it is not far removed from the realm of our immediate experience. But how can we preserve the self-evident fact of novelty and still get all the good stuff out of formative causation?
Well, I think there's a simple answer in a way, which is that the entire evolutionary cosmology of which formative causation is part, I mean, it makes sense because if we live in an evolutionary universe, then it makes sense for the regulative principles of all things to evolve rather than be fixed as eternal laws. And the standard view, of course, is that the regularities of nature are all governed by unchanging laws of nature, which were totally eternal and all there before the Big Bang. Well, that's the standard cosmology. But if one moves into the Big Bang cosmology, which is what I'm trying to do with this idea of an evolutionary universe, and habits, the laws of nature as habits, is to say that everything evolves, even the regularities of nature, then the very basis of the Big Bang cosmology is that the driving force of evolution, which is one of expansion. The Big Bang is the initiation of an ongoing expansion of the universe. And the entire cosmology we have tells us that the universe is expanding, the redshift of the galaxies and so on. The whole of modern cosmology is based on an underlying expansion of the universe. And it's this expansion which, first of all, allowed the Big Bang to cool down enough so that particles, nuclear particles, could form, and it then cooled enough for atoms to form, and then enough for molecules to form. And the emergence of form, the progressive emergence of form in the subatomic and the atomic and the molecular and the chemical realms, and through the forms of stars and galaxies, and then ultimately of planetary systems, the emergence of all this form has only been made possible by a progressive cooling process, which is the other side of the expansion process, because forms such as you and me couldn't exist at 25 billion degrees centigrade, which is how the universe began, and nor could anything else here, nor could the solid rocks of the Earth. I mean, there's a cooling process which is linked to the universal expansion, which one could regard as the primary cause or of the novelty wave. I mean, there's going to be novelty if the universe is always expanding, if there's always new space, new territory, new possibilities. The new space creates new possibilities in some kind of literal way. And the creation of new space and new possibilities, which is happening both at the physical and the metaphorical and at the imaginal levels, if we have a view of evolution where everything's evolving, the mind, matter, spirit, it's all part of one process. It's a great evolutionary process. Then the creation of new space, new possibilities, and new expansion means there's an ongoing novelty going to be there as an inbuilt feature of any universe of this general kind, an expanding universe, like in our Big Bang cosmology. It has to be there. The cosmology demands it. So that's an accepted, a given. So for me, the problem isn't the existence of novelty through the expansion, and I mean that's the basis of the whole cosmology. The problem would be in such a universe how to account for the stabilization of novelty so that it's just not swept away by this onrush of expansion and change, which is the underlying process of evolution. So I would see morphic resonance as a way in which the novelty of things, when new forms come into being, that persistences, habits can build up, because otherwise pure novelty without any persistence would be chaos. I mean, chaos is precisely that where no regularity emerges.
Utterly unpredictable.
And pure novelty, novelty alone, the novelty wave alone without stabilization would be chaos, endless chaos, an expanding chaos, but nothing more. And so I think that the two ideas are completely complementary. But the thing that's just occurred to me as you were talking is that if the novelty wave applies to novelty in general, as I think is its claim, not just in the human mind, not just in cockroaches and ecosystems, even in this planet, but to the whole universe. Yes?
Yes.
Well, then I deduce from that the universe is not expanding at a steady rate, the usual theory, given by the idea of Newtonian absolute time, simply cranked onto the new cosmology, but rather the expansion of the cosmos is taking place at a rate which is determined by the novelty wave, and that there should be a variable rate which should have all the fractal ripples and features of the novelty wave, if your theory is correct.
Now, where would we look for a trace of this?
I don't know, but I mean the trace, what gives the measure of the universal expansion is the cosmic microwave background radiation.
That's right, and there's argument about whether it's uniform or inhomogeneous.
That's right, but the reason why it's of such very long wavelength is because it's relic light, it's fossil light from the Big Bang, and since the universe has been expanding ever since the Big Bang, light which remains light from that first moment, which has never yet been intercepted by matter. Because when light's intercepted by matter, it stops being light, it's absorbed, unless it's reflected. But this light is light from the original. But since the universe was X hypothesized very, very small to start with, the light was very high energy, the wavelength was very, 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 very short. But as the universe expands, the same light, you see, gets sort of stretched out, and the wavelength goes longer and longer and longer. And this 3.5 K is the result of this stretching process. Its light cooled down to that wavelength corresponding to 3.5 degrees above absolute zero. But nevertheless, it should show irregularities in its wavelength. Irregularities in the change of its wavelength which reflect the novelty wave.
Well, it is true that both at its beginning and its end, the novelty wave undergoes, at its beginning, a series of balloon-like expansions, which is what these new cosmologies are calling for. Instead of a smooth Big Bang, they're calling for tremendous expansions very shortly after the beginning of the universe in a series of successive stages. So in that sense, you may be right. We were talking before we came on stage tonight, and I was saying that to my mind, in the 10 months since I've seen Rupert but have read The Presence of the Past, I've come to wonder about conceiving of what we're trying to talk about as a field exactly. That what it is its theory of formative causation. The morphogenetic field is just an image of trying to understand how this preformative causation could work. And one thought that has occurred to me about it is the Big Bang is basically tremendous energy, free energy, which, as Rupert described, goes through a series of coolings, and as it cools and energy dissipates and is lost as heat, form emerges. First the form of nuclear chemistry, then organic chemistry, then molecular chemistry, so forth and so on, but progressively more and more complex form as you move toward the point of the arrow of time. Well, rather than visualizing this as a field in which previous states, the presence of the past, where previous states are impacting on successive states, another way you could think of it is energy enters a universe in which at a very great distance ahead of time's arrow, there is a plenum of form, a kind of form of forms, if you want. And if the causality that operated within this form of forms was a two-way causality, then what you would have is the expanding shell of energy that is the universe slowly being influenced essentially by information flowing backward from the future. And so it isn't so much the presence of the past that puts the stamp of form onto things, but that form is an intimation of a future state that is a kind of maximizing of form into a kind of metaphysical hypostatization beyond our ability to conceive. Have you ever considered this possibility? We should have rehearsed that.
Well, I think so. I mean, if I take your description, you see, to be very like, I don't know if you like this or not, the similarity, but like the omega point of Teilhard de Chardin, which he sees as the goal or attractor of the entire universe. If there is to be a model of morphogenetic fields, to come back to one of your earlier points, it has to be in terms of dynamics of some kind. And the interesting thing about modern dynamics is that it's based on the idea of attractors. Systems are attracted towards states which from their point of view lie in the future. So these morphic attractors, which are the basis of the kind of dynamical models, including in chaotic dynamics, that are emerging now. And so that gives the idea, as morphogenetic fields have to have, is the idea of containing the goal or form or final state of something within themselves. The morphogenetic field of the oak tree contains in some sense the form of the fully formed oak and draws the growing seedling towards it. This is like the Aristotelian system of final causes. And so the entire nature of morphic fields is to have attractors. And the only way to model them mathematically that we have something that hints towards it at the moment is in terms of dynamics, including chaotic dynamics. The idea of non-stable endpoints or dynamic endpoints. And if one has a model of the universe based on those, and if one has also, as one does in this kind of organismic holistic universe, the idea that the microcosm mirrors the macrocosm, that the part in some sense mirrors the whole. So each system is in some way related to the whole. Then the morphic field of the entire universe must have a kind of cosmic attractor from that point of view, which is drawing the universe towards something. So that instead of, this would then, you see, lead to the view that even the flux of energy has another side to it, because we normally think of the Big Bang pushing matter out from behind, everything being pushed from last. And the Big Bang is certainly that model as an explosion. It's the original impetus of the explosion, which is pushing galaxies and the whole universe apart. But the idea of an attractor is that it's not being pushed, it's being pulled. And so the energetic causation, as we know it, is based on a pushing principle, and formative causation is based on a pulling principle towards a kind of goal or form or an attractor.
So placing it in the future is not that inappropriate.
Well, you see, if one has the idea that the universe as a whole has a morphic field, which has a morphic attractor for the evolution of the entire universe, then what could that attractor be? And we don't know what it is. It might be a kind of ever receding attractor, so the universe would just go on expanding forever and forever and forever, with an endless creation of new forms with no end. That's one possible kind of attractor.
That's one possible view.
But if there's an end, which is what the entire Judeo-Christian myth of history leads us to believe, and we're within the field of a Judeo-Christian myth of history, whether we like it or not. The whole cult of progress depends on it. And the idea that there's some kind of end or goal of history is deeply rooted in our entire culture. It comes out in some forms, you know, Star Wars and these kinds of visions of the future, of the ultimate nuclear war, and of and mostly images drawn from the book of Revelation. These are things that happen at the end of ordinary history before the coming of the millennium. Plagues, famines, seas and rivers turning red to blood, fire from heaven, and finally the great war in heaven. Signs of the end, which many of us can easily find very plausible. The approaching of a new millennium means we're absolutely bound to have a vast outbreak of millenarian prophecy. of which you're one of the earlier exponents.
Thank you very much.
But I mean, this is you're ahead of your time, but since the millennium's only 12 years away, you can't possibly be more than 12 years ahead of it, because the crescendo of profits is going to grow, obviously, as we approach January the 1st, 2000. And, you know, harmonic convergence was only the beginning of a dress rehearsal for what's going to be a mammoth revisioning. And this sense of culminations in time and of goals and ends is something very hard to escape from in our civilization. The idea of it just going on and on and on and on and on forever isn't very attractive. The Teilhard de Chardin view of an omega point is the idea of there being an end or goal to history. And then, of course, there's the pessimistic version of this, which is always associated with the postulation of dark matter, dark matter, dark mother, Kali. I mean, it's the dark one who is going to destroy all, the destructive aspect, by having enough dark matter undetectable by any instruments, which will cause the expansion to slow down owing to this dark matter in the universe, and then to contract until everything ends in the final implosion, the big crunch. Well, this is one cosmology on the market, you see. So then, of course, the return to the great cycle cosmologists who welcome that, because they see that if it's the big crunch of this universe, it could be the big bang of the next. And then you get back to endless cycles forever, which is back in the realm of archaic cosmology, eternal laws. It's where the whole tradition of our science, rooted in Greek cosmology, feels comfortable. The idea of an eternal cyclic universe with eternal laws. So, but if we have this idea of an evolutionary universe, then it seems to me the main choice is between these, either it all going in reverse or coming to a sticky end model, the big crunch, or that it just goes on and on forever and there's no end, there's no final form in some sense pulling things forward, except pure diversity for its own sake, a kind of universal free economy that goes on forever.